So in part 2, I wanted to talk about some tricks that I use for really good germination. The mix, the blocking mix that I like to use that I've kind of settled on over time, and then the timing that I swear by in soil blocking to make it a really effective and efficient technique. So first off, I have a tray here of stock that I just seeded. You can see the little seeds, the lighter color on top of each block. These could go, a lot of people will tell you you need a heat mat, you need a germination dome to cover your seedlings. I don't want any of that. I don't want to have to manage one more thing that I have to plug in. I don't want to have to store big domes. I don't want to deal with it. So I have settled on using vermiculite, fine vermiculite, to help retain moisture on the top of the blocks while also still allowing light to get to the seed. Most of the seeds that I'm starting with this method require light for germination, not all, but most. But in order for a seed to germinate, it has to be soft enough so that that outer shell can be cracked open, and you have to retain moisture in that way. Well, in this case, the top of the block is going to be the first thing that dries out, so you have to maintain moisture on the top of the block. So when I have these seeded, I just come in with fine vermiculite and sprinkle it all over the top of the blocks. I am not careful about this at all. More in one place, less in another. It doesn't seem to matter. This does an excellent job of sucking in the moisture and retaining it, again, so that those seeds are able to crack through that outer shell. The other thing that I do, instead of a dome to cover this and retain moisture, I just take a piece of saran wrap and lay it right over the top. This retains enough moisture, allows enough to escape so that these don't get moldy, but it also retains enough heat so that you don't need a heat mat. My current temperature is 68 degrees with 27% humidity. I have to keep that humidity pretty low in here because of the forced tulips, and the temperature has to remain pretty constant. So it's a little cooler than what your house would be if you were starting this in your kitchen or dining room. But that piece of saran wrap maintains the moisture. It almost continues to wet the top of the blocks as well, because you get condensation and then it drips back down on the top. So maybe that's part of the success of this method as well. This is a tray that maybe I showed in the last video of stock, that it's not 100% germination, but it's really close to that. So you get really consistent germination, and this is just putting one seed on each block. So that's my trick. At this point, these get tucked under lights. The lights are only 2 to 3 inches, 4 max, above the tray, above the blocks themselves, so that they're getting as much of that light as possible. If the light is too far away, then those rays aren't actually hitting these blocks and helping you germinate. And then once you have little seedlings, they've got to remain close so that you mimic the sun as much as possible. So that's my germination trick. For the blocking mix, I have more recently settled on a mix of seed starting mix from a big box store. This is normally peat based, and half worm castings. I originally started using Lisa Mason Ziegler from the Gardener's Workshop. She has a recipe that calls for peat, compost, green sand, and phosphorus. And I liked that recipe, but I did not have the ground phosphorus and green sand readily available. I could order it in, but that was just like one more thing that I had to remember to do. And I needed it to be easier. So I also tried and have used for several seasons Fort V from Vermont Compost Company. They have a compost mix called Fort V. And in general, I like this. Sometimes I get sent the wrong thing. This is probably because of my own ordering issues. But if you are not using a seed starting mix that is fine enough, it's very difficult for tiny little roots to make their way down through very coarse material. So I had a bag of this that I just finished up, and it just reminded me how much I don't want to use this anymore, because there are too many sticks and twigs and maybe even little rocks, which is not a big deal if you're in a seed starting tray, because there's a lot of volume that those things can take up. But since I'm in a tiny soil block and a very little root needs to be able to navigate through that, I prefer a seed starting mix. This is different than a potting mix. So when you go to Lowe's or Home Depot and you're picking up your bags for the season, a seed starting mix is likely sifted so that it's the finest material and it's not going to have some of that big coarse stuff. Again, because little roots need to be able to make their way through that material. So my favorite is to just use that seed starting mix, which is peat based, and it is sifted and it's very fine. I don't think that it holds its shape well enough so that your blocks maintain their integrity throughout the 4 or 5 weeks that they're on the tray. So I have settled on a 50-50 mix. I don't measure any of this out. It's a dump of this, a dump of that, mix it up and see if it feels right. I really like worm castings, and sometimes we make our own. We have a little worm bin that we put all of our kitchen scraps in. I also have a guy that I buy worm castings from, but these worm castings are very light and airy, and they hold a lot of moisture and help the blocks maintain their shape. So this also provides enough fertility to get the seeds started, and then the little added bit of fish fertilizer that I'm giving them over several weeks is enough to get them to the point where they're ready to be planted outside. I would also say that timing is the last thing to consider. The reason why I like soil blocking is because of the space-saving nature of it in my basement. If I have one of those larger blocks that I showed last time that has the little indentation in it that a small 3/4 inch block can fit into, this is great if you have the time and the space to do so. This larger block takes up much more space. If I was using these trays, I can maybe get 4 across and 5 or 6 down. That's a quarter or less than compared to the smaller blocks. I don't want to have to waste my time and resources. This takes a lot more material. I want to be able to go straight from these small blocks into the field. So it's necessary for me to schedule things back 4 or 5 weeks, and that's when I should be starting those seeds. If I know that a certain seed takes about 5 days to germinate, some take less than that. Some campanula, I just germinated, it took over 2 weeks to germinate that. So if you have an idea of how long that's going to take, and some of that comes with experience, some of that you can look up, but I don't want to have to bump up. I don't want to have to take this small thing and time it so that it's stressed in this small block and has to be transplanted to a larger block. That's a waste of time for my situation. If you're in a situation where you want to plant larger plants in your garden, then this makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to space effectively start seeds in small blocks, and then all of the ones that germinate get transplanted to larger blocks so that these can grow on and be large plants before they go into the ground. I tend to have a sink or swim attitude. If I plant this little plant out in this size, yay big, and it can't survive, sorry about your luck. I don't have time. You got to get growing once you're in the field. So we've refined, obviously, our crop list based on the things that grow really well for us. But I'm very careful to time these at about 4 weeks is all they need. Sometimes we stretch it to 5. I will say I've stretched it longer than that, and the plants 100% suffer. because they're ready to be moved on. Some of them suffer enough that they go ahead and start flowering and trying to set seed so that they can continue their life cycle. So it's really important that when you are using the soil blocking method, you don't look at what other people are doing on the internet and who's starting seeds and when. You have to go by your own schedule, because you know that your plants are going to be ready to go out within 4 weeks after starting in this little block. In that way, they will have a jump on the weeds in the garden, but they'll take a little bit more time to get to that larger plug or seedling that you would have had from a regular seed starting tray. But they're capable of doing that, and they're going to do that out in the elements where they need to be anyway. So that's my philosophy on it. Certainly, there are other philosophies for different situations, but for my situation, that's what works best. So I hope that you give it a try. If this is not right for you, you try it and you hate it, it's too much work, you don't like making the blocks, mixing all of this up, I have some favorite seed starting trays. I move to seed starting trays when I'm able to start seeds outside, when it's warm enough that I can have them in the elements as soon as they are born from their little seed coating. I have some favorites that I have used year after year after year. They're very high quality trays, and I have another video on that I will put in this list. So happy soil blocking.